Venice considering cap on tourist numbers to stop overcrowding. Barcelona approves new law to limit tourist numbers. Iceland considers limiting tourist numbers to protect its natural wonders. And Italy's Cinque Terre to begin limiting tourists. So this was just a snap of the headlines of the world's most renowned travel magazines like Condé Nast Traveler, Lonely Planet and Telegraph Travel from the past year only. And within these headlines, it's impossible not to recognize an important development here, and that's that more and more tourist destinations are considering to limit tourist numbers or have already taken measures to do so, as an act of protection against mass tourism. So within this presentation, I would like to discuss this issue of mass tourism, and more specifically in the case of Cinque Terre, in order to answer the question, how can tourism become a responsible activity by means of sustainable development? So let's first take a look at the developments that have been going on in the Cinque Terre region over the past few decades. Cinque Terre is located in the Liguria region in northern Italy, and it consists of 5 picturesque coastal villages which have for years been secluded from the hinterland, and they are still very difficult to reach by car, but they are now easily accessible by train, ferry or by the coastal hiking trails that connect them. So the region used to be known for their vast terraced vineyards on which a local unique wine was cultivated, and this was done completely by hand because the terraces located on the cliffs just left no room for big machinery. So 1200 hectares of vineyards used to cover the hills above the villages, but as of the 1950s, a lot of these vineyards were abandoned because their owners could not compete with large commercial wineries. So only 95 hectares of work land were left in the 1990s. And this all led to a lack of job opportunities. So in the 1990s, a lot of young inhabitants left the region, and they left the villages empty and with a largely aged population. So these developments all led to a lack of maintenance of the fragile territory, and it caused part of the stone walls which support the terraces on the hills to collapse. This all led to dangerous situations, and these effects became especially clear when in 2011 a landslide covered 2 of the villages. This was caused by heavy rainfalls, and if the fragile territory had better been maintained, the damage caused by this landslide could have been much smaller. So, a few decades earlier already, in the 1970s, the locals of Cinque Terre recognized that viniculture was the foundation of the region's cultural heritage, so they tried to counteract the deterioration of the territory by setting up initiatives to support a few remaining wine growers. And another desperate act to save the cultural heritage and protect the region's territory was the demand for the setup of a national park. So in 1997, the region was first added to the UNESCO World Heritage List as a cultural landscape, and in 1999 the Cinque Terre National Park was finally born. So the residents of Cinque Terre understood that viniculture could not be the region's main economic basis, so more and more people started making money from tourism instead. And nowadays approximately 90% of all economic activities in the Cinque Terre National Park are in some way related to tourism. So it's safe to say that the Cinque Terre area is financially dependent on tourism. But over the years, a huge change in tourism can be seen in the region, because before the establishing of the national park, the number of tourists visiting the area was around 1 million per year, and now the villages receive a number of 3 million visitors each year. And this doesn't seem huge maybe, but if you compare it to the fact that the villages just have around 5,000 inhabitants themselves, it is really huge. And this number is still growing, and part of the reason for this growth was the opening of a new cruise terminal in the nearby town of La Spezia in 2015. This all caused an increase of around 30% of the number of day trippers that visited villages of Cinque Terre. And not only can a trend be recognized in the number of tourists to visit the region, but also in the type of visitors. Because in the early years of tourism development, there would be mainly travelers which discovered the area by foot. They hiked the trails from one village to another. But more recently, with the opening of this cruise terminal, a less sustainable form of tourism started gaining ground. And these are the day trippers, so these are visitors that mainly arrive in guided groups. They visit all the 5 villages within one day. And the problem with this form of tourism is that the number of tourists to visit the national park is no longer well balanced and well spread over the villages and hiking trails, but instead they all arrive at the villages at the same time. So these villages are really overwhelmed and overcrowded with large groups of tourists. So for years the national park has been struggling against this new form of mass tourism, and just recently in February 2016 the national park hit the news with the announcement that it would limit the number of tourists to 1.5 million a year. However, this announcement turned out to be false because the national park indeed intended to do so, but the initiative was rejected by the local Italian government. So, if we look at these developments, 3 key players can be recognized that play a part in them. So I just want to take a look at the issue from their perspective. On one hand, we have the tourists, who play a significant role in the situation and who can in some way be seen as the source of the problem that the region is facing at the moment. The reason for tourists to visit the Cinque Terre are obvious, because this region is so unique and distinguishes itself from other coastal destinations in Italy. They're really picturesque, beautiful, typical Italian villages, and they have this unique cultural heritage with the wine growing history and these beautiful hiking trails. So this makes the region very unique and attractive. And looking at some global trends in tourism, we see that tourists nowadays, especially the millennials, are really interested in getting these enriching experiences in local culture. So wherever they go, they just want to dive into the local culture and experience what makes their destination so unique and special. And also tourists nowadays are more and more aware of the environmental impact of their tourism, and so they are more and more supportive of sustainable tourism. As I said earlier, there are 2 types of visitors that visit Cinque Terre. So they are the travelers, so to say, who really stay in the area and they visit the area for a longer period of time. They hike the trails. So they are really of economic value for the area, but they also put a lot of pressure on these trails, this fragile territory which has been neglected for so long. And then there are the day trippers, which arrive in the area and visit the villages in one day, and they are also of economic value, but they overcrowd these villages, so they also have their negative impact. Looking at another perspective from the private sector, which includes businesses and local investors, such as hotel chains, supermarkets, tour companies, they just see profitable business opportunities in the area. And this is understandable because it's an increasingly popular tourist destination. But the goal of these businesses is merely to exploit the high number of the visitors that visit the region and to make money. And a lot of inhabitants are working in tourism business. So on one hand, they do provide job opportunities, like for example with the creation of the new cruise terminal. But on the other hand, they are also responsible for the fast-growing influx of tourists in the area. So that also causes a lot of problems on the other hand. And also we should distinguish between local businesses and foreign businesses, because local businesses generate income for the inhabitants of the area. However, there are also non-local businesses who take money out of the area. So over the years, the national park and the inhabitants have fought against these non-local businesses, for example by restricting their construction and by supporting local shops. But still, they are there. And a third key player that can be identified is the destination itself. So this includes local inhabitants, the local government, as well as the national park. So the inhabitants of the area are in a complex situation because on one hand they suffer from the tourism development, but they are also dependent on it. They just really want to live a good quality life, and preferably the way they used to do years ago. But they have to work in tourism, and they are also thankful for it, but it shouldn't develop at cost of their cultural identity and their cultural values. And the local government also plays an important role because they have the power to imply laws that can regulate tourism development and to accept or decline initiatives. And for example, they also played a huge role in setting up the national park. But they also have the power to decline their initiatives, like the initiative to put a cap on tourism, as I mentioned before. And so, as I said, the national park was established on demand of the inhabitants in order to preserve the region's heritage and cultural landscapes. But though it might seem contradictory, the national park is actually dependent on incomes from tourism for the maintenance and preservation of the area. Thus, the goal of the Cinque Terre National Park is to foster tourism development, respecting the environmental and nature values. And this task was assigned to the national park at its setup, and so it makes the park authorities basically morally responsible for preserving the area. But the role of the national park and of the local government is a bit controversial because, for example, in 2010, the head of the national park as well as some members of the local government were arrested because they were claimed to have exploited the national park's financial resources for the wrong objectives. So are they really focusing on preserving the cultural heritage and protecting the area? Looking at what I've told so far, it's clear that an ethical issue is going on in Cinque Terre, and that is that tourism is now thriving and developing, but at cost of the environment and the quality of life of the local inhabitants. So the question really is, where does territory and cultural heritage stand on the priority list? The problem is that the region is financially dependent on tourism, so without it, it would not be a livable place anymore. But the tourism development as it is now is having huge negative impacts. The villages are overcrowded, which has a big impact on the lives of the inhabitants because they now have to share their small territory with big herds of tourists. And also the tourists that walk the hiking trails are really putting a lot of pressure on this fragile environment, which only increases its deterioration, leading to even more dangerous situations. So if the number of tourists continues to grow like it has done over the past years, soon the hiking trails will not be accessible anymore and it will be practically impossible to live a normal life in these villages because they are just so crowded. And also the focus on tourism means that less local inhabitants are actually practicing the traditional way of life because they're now focusing on gaining income from tourism. So this unique cultural heritage, this culture that makes this region so special, is disappearing because of this. And if you think about it, if tourism continues to develop like this, the region will actually lose its attractiveness as a tourist destination because everything that makes Cinque Terre so special will be forgotten or destroyed. So the ethical issue that is going on is, should we allow excessive tourism development in an area if we know that it's slowly destroying and ruining a unique environment, cultural heritage and the quality of life of the inhabitants? So as I said before, the national park was actually set up to make sure that doesn't happen. But the national park is highly dependent on the local government, and it has had quite a controversial role in the past, so it creates some doubts about the parks and the government's priorities. Looking at the national park, they say they are working on sustainable development and maintenance of the park. But how come that since the landslide in 2011, some hiking trails still remain closed because maintenance still needs to be carried out after 6 years? And is the national park actually putting in enough effort in maintenance of the territory? Looking at the local government, are they actually focusing on what's best for the region, or are they focusing on creating money? Why didn't they accept the National Parks initiative to put a cap on tourism? The fact that Cinque Terre as a whole and also the national park are dependent on tourist incomes makes the issue so much more complicated. But still, I'd like to compare it with the human body. So people are dependent on food to live, like Cinque Terre is dependent on tourism. So for people it's necessary to eat, but excessive eating will cause overweight and will eventually have such negative effects on the body that it will lead to death. So this happens in Cinque Terre as well. It's creating excessive tourism now, but it's having such negative effects that in the future everything that makes the area special will be gone. And what do people do when they're overweight? They diet, and I believe that's exactly what should happen in Cinque Terre and what is happening in many more tourist destinations around the world. They just go on a diet from tourism. So if we look at theory, the developments that are going on in Cinque Terre and other tourist destinations can be linked to the concept of carrying capacity. And this can really be seen as a guideline for the number of tourists and the type of visitors that a destination can accommodate without having the damaging effects on the resources of the destination or on the quality of the visitor experience. So it's really looking at both sides, tourist and destination. And carrying capacity is a useful management tool which can be used to guide tourism development while protecting a region's values and resources and assuring an enjoyable visitor experience. But it's a concept that's very difficult to calculate because it includes many aspects and it's influenced by many factors. So basically there are three different types of carrying capacity: physical, economic and social carrying capacity. So physical carrying capacity really refers to the physical and ecological effects of tourism. So this really relates to the environment. While economic carrying capacity refers to the balance between economic activities in tourism and economic activities that are adapted to the local inhabitants. And social carrying capacity refers to the level of tolerance of local inhabitants towards the staying and the behavior of tourists that visit a certain destination. So recognizing these three types of carrying capacities can ease the process of calculating the levels of carrying capacity. And it's also important to note that carrying capacity limits mostly depend on two important factor groups, which is the characteristic of the tourist and the characteristics of the tourist destination. So characteristics of the tourist include aspects like level of usage, the length of their stay, the seasonal traffic, the type of tourist activities they perform, etc. And the characteristics of the destination include aspects like the natural geographical characteristics of the destination, the economic structure, the social structure, etc. So these are aspects that influence carrying capacity and they need to be taken into account when calculating capacity limits. And even though this is a very complex and maybe even impossible task, it is still important to note the importance of carrying capacity in sustainable development. So given that tourism does influence a destination in physical, economic and social ways, setting a carrying capacity limit can be a very useful instrument for managing these influences and for going towards a successful tourism development strategy, also in Cinque Terre. Looking at literature about this topic, it becomes clear that national park authorities, such as the Cinque Terre National Park, can play a significant role in calculating carrying capacity and in managing sustainable and responsible tourism development by applying concepts of carrying capacity. So according to the literature, the main goal of national parks is to protect the natural environment and to make the park resources available to the public. And this is mostly done by allowing tourism to the area. However, given the protective function of national parks, tourism allowed to the area should meet the standards of sustainable and responsible tourism. And on the Cinque Terre National Park's website, its goal is said to be fostering a tourism development respecting the environmental and nature values. And I believe this statement only pinpoints the fact that the Cinque Terre National Park is responsible for maintaining sustainable tourism development in the area. And of course, tourists and the private sector play a part in the current situation, but the national park was set up specifically to preserve the territory and maintain the cultural heritage of the area. So it's therefore the task of the national park to do so and basically indicate to tourists and businesses from the private sector what the boundaries are for the sake of sustainable development. However, the national park can definitely not do this without the support of the local government, who in my eyes should take responsibility as well. I believe it is the moral responsibility of the government to take care of the region and its inhabitants, so they should allow the national park to implement initiatives that are meant to safeguard sustainable tourism development instead of rejecting these initiatives like they did last year. I believe that this all indicates that the priorities of the local government are currently wrong. So, looking at the goals of the national park, these goals should be achieved by regulating tourism intensity and accepting only selected forms of tourism, and basically, as I said before, go on a tourism diet. So yes, there should be put limits on tourism based on the calculated carrying capacity. So calculating the carrying capacity will provide the Cinque Terre National Park with a guideline for the numbers of tourists that the region can accommodate without it having damaging effect on the resources as well as on the tourist experience. And based on this guideline, they can set a limit on tourism. Looking at other national parks and World Heritage sites, there are various destinations which have already successfully applied tourism limits. For example, Machu Picchu has already implemented this ticketing system for years, which allow only 2,500 visitors per day to enter the site. And this not only relieves the stress put on the heritage site in terms of the ecological system, but also improves the tourist experience. And another example is Antarctica, which only allows cruise ships with less than 500 passengers to land on shore and only allows 100 people at a time to actually go on shore in order to protect their fragile ecosystem. Another example is Lord Howe Island near Australia, which was listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and only allows 400 tourists to stay at the island at a time. So there are only 400 tourist beds on the island. And today 75% of the island's natural vegetation still remains intact, which only proves the success of this measure. So these destinations are just some examples of how national parks and World Heritage sites can successfully put a cap on tourism, and that's exactly what the Cinque Terre National Park should do as well, in my opinion. And looking at the exact managerial actions the Cinque Terre National Park should perform, as I said, they should go on a tourism diet, and I believe that putting a 1,5 million limit on the yearly number of tourism like they proposed last year is a bit too general, because this would still mean that the majority of tourists will probably still overcrowd Cinque Terre in the high season, which doesn't really solve the problem. So instead, I think the national park should limit the number of day trippers that visit the villages, and therefore they should work together with the cruise lines and touring companies to limit the number of passengers that visit the villages each day, based on a calculated carrying capacity. So then cruise lines and bus tour companies would then only be allowed to sell a certain number of tickets every day. This action only fights against the crowding in the villages themselves. Additionally, I believe that the national park should put a limit on the tourist number of visitors that are allowed to walk the trails behind the villages, because these visitors put a lot of strain on the territory. And therefore I think there should also be a daily limit on the number of visitors to hike the pass. And this can easily be done, I believe, because now already tourists need to buy a ticket, so they just need to put a limit on the number of those tickets. Besides the above, or the before mentioned, I believe that there should be a diversification of the tickets depending on the tourism season, meaning that ticket prices will be higher in high season as compared to off season. So this would form an incentive to tourists to visit the area out of peak season times. And in general, I also think ticket prices should be slightly higher because the tickets to hike the trails are now fairly cheap. They're just a couple of euros per person, and higher ticket prices will ensure greater income that can be spent on maintaining the park and preserving the region's cultural heritage. And the income should, for instance, be used to set up educational programs meant to create even more awareness about the importance of managing the region's cultural heritage and preserving the territory. And of course, all of these implications have consequences, both negative and positive. So looking at the negative consequences, these managerial actions mean that less tourists will be able to visit the Cinque Terre region at a time. So this will surely result in a loss of income, which is a negative consequence that the destination and the private sector will have to deal with. However, on the other hand, limiting tourist numbers will enhance the quality of life for the inhabitants because the villages will not be as overcrowded as they used to be, and tourism will be more balanced. Additionally, it will also improve the visitor experience because tourists will be able to enjoy the villages more if they're less crowded. So looking at the fact that the income from tourism will probably be lower because there will be less tourists, I think this can be compensated by slightly higher ticket prices. And increasing the prices will be acceptable because the visitor experience will be so much better. And besides the fact that these implications will fight against overcrowding, they will also mean that less pressure is put on the fragile territory in the region, so this will give more rest to the environment. And also using the incomes from the national park for initiatives like educating tourists about the importance of preservation will make them more aware of their footprint. Besides, the national park's income should be used to do maintenance work on the terraces and stimulate local initiatives to preserve the cultural heritage, which will in turn also improve the visitor experience because tourists nowadays are really interested in getting these enriching cultural experience, and they are also more and more interested in sustainability. If we now look back at the question that I asked at the start, I definitely believe that tourism in Cinque Terre can become a responsible activity again. However, the national park and the local governments should take their responsibility, and that is to take care of the territory and the area, so they should set boundaries and put a limit on tourism. And all in all, these measures are definitely necessary to save Cinque Terre's territory and cultural heritage. And if it doesn't happen now, everything that makes the Cinque Terre so special will be gone in a couple years' time. But if it does happen right, like I proposed, the cultural heritage of Cinque Terre can be saved and tourists will be able to enjoy this unique site for many more years to come. And yeah, undoubtedly, putting in these measures will take some time and a lot of effort, will have its negative effect, but also its positive effects. And all stakeholders have to support them, but I'm sure that these measures will ensure a brighter future for the region.